The night my father asked me to leave the house I paid for, he didn't raise his voice. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation like you see in the movies. Just a quiet conversation over cold coffee at the kitchen table, the kind of calm that makes your stomach drop because you know something terrible is coming. My name was on the mortgage. I made the down payment. I paid every single bill that kept the lights on and the heat running. And yet, sitting across from me with that expression I'd seen 1,000 times before, my father looked me in the eye and said my brother needed it more. What happened next cost my family far more than they ever imagined, and if you think you know how this story ends, I promise you don't. This decision changed everything, and by the time my father realized what he'd done, it was already too late to undo it. If this story resonates with you, or if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, leave a comment below. Your story matters, and I read every single one. Understanding how we got to that moment requires going back, way back to when my brother Derek and I were kids growing up in suburban Ohio. We weren't poor, but we weren't wealthy either. My father worked in manufacturing management, my mother was a school secretary, and we lived the kind of middle-class American life, where vacations meant driving to a lake cabin and splurging meant going to Red Lobster for someone's birthday. But even in those early years, there was a pattern forming that I didn't have the language to describe yet. Derek was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment he could walk and talk, he occupied a different space in our family ecosystem than I did. When I brought home a report card with straight A's, my father would nod and say that's what he expected from me. When Derek brought home B's and C's, there would be celebration, encouragement, praise for his effort. When I made the baseball team, it was assumed I would. When Derek made the team 2 years later, my father took the day off work to celebrate. I learned early that my role was to be fine, to be capable, to need nothing. Derek's role was to be protected, supported, given chance after chance to find his way. My father's values were old-fashioned in the way that many men of his generation were. He believed in loyalty above all else, in families staying together no matter what, in sacrifice being the highest virtue. He'd grown up poor himself, the youngest of 6 kids, and he'd watched his older siblings take care of him when their parents couldn't. I think he internalized a story about himself as someone who'd been saved by family obligation, and he spent the rest of his life trying to recreate that dynamic, always looking for the person who needed saving. Derek became that person. Not because he was the youngest, not because he was less capable, but because somewhere along the way he learned that being vulnerable, being in need, being the one who required rescuing, that was how you got my father's attention. And I learned the opposite lesson. I learned that competence made you invisible, that solving your own problems meant being left alone to solve even bigger problems, that the reward for not needing help was never getting any. Derek's pattern started small. In high school, he'd borrow money and forget to pay it back. He'd get in minor trouble, nothing serious, just enough that my parents had to get involved, had to advocate for him, had to make excuses. He went to college on my parents' dime and dropped out after a year and a half. Then there was a string of jobs that never quite worked out, always because of a boss who didn't understand him or a company that didn't appreciate his talents. Then a girlfriend who was supposedly crazy, then a roommate who supposedly stole from him, then a car that broke down at the worst possible time. There was always something, always a crisis that required intervention, and my father was always there with his wallet open and his explanations ready. Derek wasn't irresponsible, he just had bad luck. Derek wasn't lazy, he just hadn't found his calling yet. Derek wasn't taking advantage, he was family, and family helps each other. Meanwhile, I was doing what I'd always done. I went to state college on scholarships and worked 2 jobs to cover what the scholarships didn't. I graduated with a degree in accounting, got hired at a regional firm, and spent my 20s building the kind of stable, Unremarkable career that doesn't make for interesting dinner conversation, but pays the bills on time. I bought a sensible car. I saved money. I didn't call my parents asking for help because I'd learned that asking for help meant being told I should have planned better. When I was 29, I'd saved enough for a down payment on a house. Not a big house, not a fancy house, just a modest 3-bedroom ranch in a decent neighborhood about 40 minutes from where I grew up. The mortgage was manageable on my salary, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had something that was truly mine. Something I'd built without anyone's help. Something that proved I was capable of taking care of myself. That's when my father approached me with what he called an opportunity. He was thinking about retiring early, he said, and he and my mother wanted to downsize from the family home. They didn't need 4 bedrooms anymore. But before they sold the house, he wanted to make sure the family stayed connected. He suggested that instead of them moving into a retirement community or a smaller place on their own, what if they moved closer to me? What if we thought of my house as a family investment? They wouldn't live there full-time, he explained, but it could be a landing pad for family gatherings, a place where Derek could stay when he was between situations, somewhere that kept us all within reach of each other. And because I was doing so well financially, because I was so stable and responsible, wouldn't it make sense for me to be the anchor? Looking back, the warning signs were all there. The way he framed it as my success story. The way he made it sound like I'd be doing them a favor by letting them help me with my mortgage. The way Derek's name came up almost immediately, couched in phrases like, just until he gets back on his feet, and you know how hard it's been for him. But I wanted to believe my father saw me. I wanted to believe that for once, my competence was being recognized not as an excuse to ignore me, but as a reason to value me. So I said yes. I said they could use the spare room when they visited. I said Derek could crash there if he needed to. I said we were family, and family helps each other. I had no idea I was handing them the keys to dismantle everything I'd built. For the first year, it was fine. My parents visited once a month, stayed a weekend, and left. Derek showed up twice, stayed a week each time, and left without incident. I was still the primary resident. The house was still mine. My name was on every document, every bill, every piece of mail that mattered. Then my father retired, and the dynamic started to shift. Suddenly his visits became longer. 2 weekends became a week. A week became 10 days. He started talking about the house like it belonged to all of us, referring to it as the family house in conversations with relatives and friends. He'd rearrange furniture without asking. He'd make decisions about landscaping and repairs and act surprised when I pointed out that I was the one paying for these things. And when I tried to set boundaries, tried to remind him that this was my house, and I was just being generous by sharing it, he'd look at me with this expression of deep disappointment and say something like, "I thought you understood what family meant." Then Derek's latest situation fell apart. He'd been living with a girlfriend in Colorado, working at a ski resort, and according to him, everything collapsed at once. The girlfriend left him. The job ended with the season. He had no money and no prospects and nowhere to go. My father called me on a Tuesday evening and told me Derek was flying in that weekend and would be staying at the house until he figured things out. Not asking. Telling. I said fine, but just for a few weeks. My father agreed. Derek showed up with 3 suitcases and a broken promise. Weeks turned into months. He wasn't looking for work, at least not in any serious way. He was taking time to figure out his next move and dealing with depression from the breakup. My father was at the house constantly now, cooking meals for Derek, doing his laundry, basically recreating the parent-child dynamic from 30 years ago, except now it was happening in my house, with my utilities on my dime. I tried talking to Derek directly. I suggested job openings. I offered to help him with his resume. He'd nod and thank me and then do nothing. When I pushed harder, He'd get emotional, tell me I didn't understand what he was going through, that I'd always had it easy because I was naturally good at adulting. When I tried talking to my father, he'd tell me I was being impatient, that Derek needed support, not pressure, that family means being there for each other in hard times. When I pointed out that I was paying for all of this, he'd remind me that I made good money and Derek didn't, that I could afford to be generous. The word afford started to feel like a weapon. Because I could afford it, I should do it. Because I was stable, I should be destabilized. Because I'd built something, it was now available to be taken. 6 months after Derek moved in, I was barely living there myself. I'd started staying later at work, taking on extra projects, anything to avoid going home to a house that didn't feel like mine anymore. My father had essentially moved in too, claiming he needed to be there to help Derek through his depression. My mother would visit on weekends, and the 4 of us would sit around the dinner table like a family, except I felt like a guest in my own home. I couldn't leave my laptop out without Derek borrowing it. I couldn't stock my favorite food without it being eaten. I couldn't have friends over without my father giving me a look that said I was being rude to Derek by excluding him. Every boundary I tried to set was met with accusations of selfishness. Every time I mentioned that my name was on the mortgage, I was reminded that family doesn't keep score. Then came the dinner conversation that changed everything. It was a Sunday evening in late October, the kind of gray autumn day when it gets dark at 5 o'clock and the cold seeps into your bones. My father had made pot roast, one of his signatures, and we were sitting around the kitchen table, my father and Derek and me. The conversation was casual, surface-level stuff about Derek's job applications that we all knew he wasn't actually submitting, and my father's plans to finally fix the back fence. Then, without warning, my father set down his fork and said we needed to talk about the house situation. He said it had become clear that the current arrangement wasn't working. He said Derek needed stability, needed a permanent place where he felt secure and could really focus on rebuilding his life. And then he said that he and my mother had been thinking and they believed the best solution would be for me to move out and let Derek stay. I sat there in stunned silence, waiting for the punchline. But my father kept talking, his tone calm and rational, like he was discussing the weather. He said I was never really there anyway, that I spent most of my time at work or staying with friends. He said Derek needed the space more because he was home all day. He said I could easily afford to rent an apartment closer to my office, that it would probably be more convenient for me anyway. He said this was temporary, just until Derek got back on his feet, maybe a year or 2. He said the house had always been understood as family property, that my buying it had been for the benefit of all of us. And then he held out his hand, palm up, waiting for me to hand over my keys like it was the most reasonable request in the world. Derek was watching me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite guilt, not quite triumph. Something in between. My father's eyes were steady on mine, and I could see he genuinely believed what he was saying. He'd reframed the entire narrative in his mind. I hadn't bought this house with my own money, my own credit, my own years of saving. No, I'd been the vehicle through which the family acquired a house. I was the responsible one, the capable one, so obviously I'd be fine somewhere else. Derek was the one who needed it. Derek was the one who had to be protected. And I was supposed to understand, supposed to agree, supposed to sacrifice because that's what family does. I don't remember what I said in that moment. I think I said something about needing to think about it, needing time to process. But my father's expression shifted from patient to disappointed. He said there wasn't much to think about, that they'd already started packing some of my things from the spare bedroom to make it easier for me. That's when it hit me. They'd already decided. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't a request. They'd made a plan, executed the first steps, and were now simply informing me of the new reality. My brother was planning to move into my bedroom. My father had already reassigned the rooms. They were waiting for me to accept what had already been decided without me. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a family. This was a hierarchy, and I'd been demoted. I left the house that night and checked into a hotel. I didn't pack anything, didn't make a scene, just walked out while my father was still talking, explaining, justifying. I sat in that generic hotel room with its sanitized smell and terrible art, and I felt something shift inside me. All my life, I'd played by the rules. I'd been responsible, self-sufficient, undemanding. I'd believed that if I just proved myself capable enough, eventually I'd be valued. Eventually I'd matter. But sitting there in that hotel room, I understood the truth. My competence hadn't made me valued. It had made me useful. And the moment I stopped being useful in the way they wanted, the moment I suggested that my needs might matter too, I became the problem. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I called in sick for the first time in 3 years and spent the day making phone calls. First to the bank that held my mortgage, then to a real estate lawyer, then to my insurance company. I pulled every document related to that house. Every mortgage statement with my name and only my name. Every deed record showing sole ownership. Every bank statement showing every payment coming from my account and only my account. My father had said the house was family property. My father was wrong. Legally, explicitly, undeniably wrong. And that wrongness was about to become very expensive for him. The mortgage company was very clear. Only the person on the mortgage could make decisions about the property. My father had no legal standing. Derek had no legal claim. The house was mine, and any attempt to force me out or transfer occupancy without my consent would be considered trespassing. The lawyer was even more direct. What my father was attempting was illegal. If they'd already moved my belongings or changed locks or taken any action that prevented me from accessing my own property, I had grounds for a lawsuit. If they refused to leave when asked, I could pursue eviction. The insurance agent added another wrinkle. If Derek was living there as a permanent resident without being on the policy, and if something happened, the claim could be denied. My father, in his determination to save my brother, had put himself and Derek in a legally precarious position and apparently hadn't bothered to check. I spent 3 days gathering information, building a timeline, documenting every conversation I could remember. Then I called my father. I told him I wanted to meet at the house to discuss the situation. He sounded relieved, probably thinking I'd come to accept his plan. When I arrived, both he and Derek were there, sitting in my living room like they owned it. I sat down across from them and set my folder of documents on the coffee table. Then I explained, very calmly, very clearly, exactly what the legal situation was. I showed them the mortgage with my name. I showed them the deed with my name. I explained what the bank had told me, what the lawyer had told me, what the insurance company had told me. I explained that they had no legal right to be there without my permission, and that my permission was contingent on them following my rules. And then I told them they had 2 weeks to make other arrangements because they were leaving. My father's face went through several transformations. First confusion, like he couldn't quite process what I was saying. Then dismissal, like I was being dramatic. Then anger, but not the explosive kind. The cold kind. He said I was being selfish. He said I was betraying family. He said he'd raised me better than this. Derek stayed quiet, but I could see panic creeping into his eyes. He'd gotten comfortable. He'd started believing this was permanent. And now the foundation was being pulled out from under him. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just repeated the facts. 2 weeks. After that, if they weren't gone, I'd begin eviction proceedings. My father stood up, told me I'd regret this, told me I was destroying the family over money and pride. Then he walked out. Derek stayed for a moment longer, and for just a second, I thought he might apologize. might acknowledge what had happened. But instead he said, "You really are just like Dad always said. Cold." Then he left too. The next 2 weeks were brutal. My father tried every strategy he'd ever used to control me. First, he gave me the silent treatment, thinking I'd cave to avoid conflict. When that didn't work, he tried guilt. He called my mother, had her call me crying about how I was tearing the family apart. He called relatives, painted a story where I'd kicked out my struggling brother and my elderly parents for no reason. He showed up at my office, demanding to talk, trying to negotiate. He offered to pay rent, offered to put Derek on a payment plan, offered everything except the one thing I actually wanted, which was for them to acknowledge that they'd tried to take something that wasn't theirs. Derek went between rage and desperation. He texted me long messages about how hard his life was, how I didn't understand, how this would kill him. Then he'd text me threats about how I'd be sorry, how karma was real, how family never forgets. I blocked his number. I blocked my father's number. I told my mother I loved her, but I wouldn't discuss this with her until it was resolved. I felt like I was going insane, like maybe I was the villain in this story. But then I'd look at those documents. My name, my money, my house. And I'd remember that I hadn't done anything wrong except trust my family not to betray me. On day 13, my father finally hired a lawyer. The lawyer called my lawyer. The conversation lasted about 20 minutes. My lawyer called me back and said the other attorney had advised his client to vacate immediately because there was no legal path forward for them. They had no claim. They had no leverage. They were trespassing. On day 14, I had the locks changed. On day 15, I came home to find the house empty except for my belongings scattered everywhere and a note from my father on the kitchen table. It said, "You won. I hope you're happy." Nothing else. No apology. No acknowledgement of what they'd tried to do. Just anger at being stopped. The next few months were quiet in a way that felt loud. My mother would call occasionally, trying to play mediator, but she couldn't bring herself to admit what my father and Derek had done was wrong. She just kept saying everyone had made mistakes. Everyone needed to forgive. We were family. But we weren't family. We were people related by blood who'd realized we had fundamentally different values about what obligation and respect mean. My father had taught me that family means sacrifice, but he'd never specified that only some people have to sacrifice while others get to take. Derek had learned that being vulnerable was a strategy, but he'd never learned that eventually people run out of willingness to save you. And I'd learned that competence without boundaries just makes you a resource to be exploited. The house became mine again in the way it should have always been. I had friends over, without feeling like I needed permission. I left my things where I wanted them. I made decisions about paint colors and furniture without consulting anyone. It should have felt like victory, but mostly it felt like loss. Not loss of my father or Derek. I'd lost them years ago. I just hadn't admitted it yet. Loss of the story I'd told myself about who we were. I'd wanted so badly to believe that if I was just good enough, responsible enough, selfless enough, I'd finally be seen as valuable. But my father had seen me as valuable. That was the problem. He'd seen me as valuable in the way you see a tool, as valuable. Useful for a purpose. To be put away when not needed. To be sacrificed when something more important comes along. About 6 months after they moved out, Derek called me from my mother's phone, probably thinking I wouldn't answer his number. He wanted to talk, he said. He'd been in therapy. He was working on himself. He understood now what had happened, how he'd taken advantage, how my father had enabled him. He was sorry. He wanted to repair our relationship. Part of me wanted to believe him. The younger version of myself, the one who still thought family could be fixed with enough effort, wanted to say yes. But I'd learned something crucial in those months alone. An apology without change behavior is just manipulation with better words. So I told him I appreciated the call, but I needed time. Maybe someday. But not yet. My father never called. Never apologized. Never acknowledged that he tried to take my house and give it to my brother. Instead, he started telling a different story to our extended family. In his version, I'd offered to let Derek stay, then changed my mind without warning and threw them both out. I'd become unreasonable, cold, greedy. Some relatives believed him.
Some reached out to me for my side.
Some just stayed quiet, unwilling to choose. I stopped trying to correct the narrative. The people who mattered, who actually knew me, they knew the truth. The others could believe what they wanted. What surprised me most was how the betrayal clarified everything. For years I'd felt like something was wrong with me because I could never quite earn my father's approval in the way Derek could. I'd thought if I just worked harder, achieved more, needed less, eventually I'd be the favored son. But I'd misunderstood the game entirely. Derek wasn't favored because he was better. He was favored because he was worse. My father didn't value success. He valued need. He valued the feeling of being necessary, being the hero, being the one who saved the day. Derek gave him that. I never could because I'd made the mistake of actually listening to my father's advice about being independent and responsible. I'd become someone who didn't need saving, and in my father's eyes, that made me useless to his narrative about himself. The house is worth more now than when I bought it. The neighborhood has improved. Property values have gone up. I've been promoted twice at work. I'm dating someone who thinks my boundary setting is healthy, not selfish. I have friends who respect my space and my time. My life is objectively better than it was when my father sat at that kitchen table and told me to leave my own house. But there's still a part of me that grieves what could have been. Not what was had always been broken, I just hadn't wanted to see it. But what could have been if my father had been capable of loving both his sons equally? If Derek had been held accountable instead of enabled? If my family had been a place where success was celebrated instead of punished? I think that's what people don't understand about family betrayal. It's not just about what they took or tried to take. It's about what they revealed. My father revealed that his love was conditional, that it depended on me playing a specific role, and the moment I stepped out of that role, I became expendable. Derek revealed that our relationship had always been transactional, that he'd never seen me as a brother but as a resource. My mother revealed that peace was more important to her than justice, that she'd rather I pretend everything was fine than hold anyone accountable. And I revealed something about myself too, that I was willing to lose a family to keep my dignity, that I valued ownership and autonomy more than the illusion of connection, that I'd rather be alone and respected than surrounded and used. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled it, if I wish I'd been more flexible, more forgiving, more willing to compromise. The answer is no. Because compromise requires two parties negotiating in good faith. My father wasn't negotiating.
He was dictating.
And I'd spent 35 years compromising myself into invisibility. The house wasn't really about the house. It was about the principle. It was about whether I was a person with rights or just a resource for other people to allocate as they saw fit. It was about whether family meant mutual respect or just unilateral obligation. And when faced with that choice, I chose myself. The last time I drove past my childhood home, it looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller, just less significant. The place where I learned to be invisible, where I learned that needing nothing made you worth nothing, where I learned to sacrifice myself for people who would never sacrifice for me. It's just a house now. Just walls and a roof and windows. The power it had over me is gone. My father still lives there with my mother. Derek stayed with them for another year before moving in with a new girlfriend. We don't talk. We don't visit. On holidays, my mother sends text messages suggesting we should all get together, and I send polite responses about being busy. Maybe someday that will change. Maybe someday my father will understand what he did. Maybe someday Derek will actually change instead of just promising to. Maybe someday I'll be willing to risk it again. But probably not. Because some lessons cost more than money. This one cost a family. And the truth is, what I lost wasn't worth keeping. What I kept was worth everything. Was this justice, or was it just accountability? I'm still not entirely sure there's a difference. What I know is that the night I walked out of that hotel and decided to fight for what was mine, I wasn't fighting for a house. I was fighting for the right to exist as something other than an instrument of someone else's needs. And that fight, as painful and lonely as it was the most important one of my life. Because it taught me that sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you need. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the people who bleed you dry. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop sacrificing yourself at the altar of other people's dysfunction and build something that's truly yours. Even if you have to build it alone. The house is quiet now. Peaceful.
Mine.
And I've learned to stop waiting for my father to walk through the door and finally see me. Because I see myself now. And that was always enough.